Welcome again to the new history series where we talk to you about some of the notable releases from a certain year in heavy metal history. Now, due to popular demand, I'm actually going to do pre-1980. My very first video was on 1980, and we will do every year from that point in history. But we're going to do a compilation vid today, and we're going to do everything, all the notable releases prior to 1980, and that is the name of the game. So I'll give you some of my picks, some of the notable releases, and then my favourites from everything before 1980 in heavy metal history. Now, as you know, heavy metal is a web. There's so many genres, so many different sub-genres, but it was a much simpler time back then, back in 1970, when this all began. And it started, well, you guessed it, started with Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath released their debut album 1970. They released a debut album at the self-titled, you guys probably all know it, the classic cover, one of the best album arts in history, and this is still amazing today. The very first metal album, still amazing today. Listen to some of these songs, still fucking flawless. The song Black Sabbath from the album Black Sabbath by the band Black Sabbath is one of the best songs. It just is. The Wizard, Evil Woman, all the songs on this debut are still fantastic today. And it is the very first doom metal album as well, which you probably wouldn't think, you just think it's classic heavy metal, but this is the album which kind of made doom what it is as well. So this is a landmark release, the first heavy metal album, and there's a lot of rock albums before this, you know, you could argue that there was heavy metal before this album, but I think in terms of heaviness, the guitars, everything, this is the album that sparked everything. 1970s debut, but it isn't my favourite. My favourite Sabbath album is Masters of Reality. Master of Reality came out in 1971, so 1 year later, they came out with this, which is, in my opinion, one of the best. And aside from Heaven and Hell, which I already talked about in my previous video, 1980, the second best Sabbath album, in my opinion. I love this album. I think it's one of Ozzy's best, one of his strongest efforts. Children of the Grave, Solitude, so many hits, so many classics, and the sound of it, so trippy, doomy. So doomy and trippy. I love the sound on this album. Again, Black Sabbath had a number of hits, number of hit albums throughout the 70s. I mean, Paranoid came out as well, but I prefer the debut and I prefer Master of Reality, so those are the two we're going to talk about today. But yeah, fantastic album, still to this day, pioneered the fucking genre of heavy metal itself. Has to be the biggest name on this list, has to be talked about, and has to be loved and enjoyed. Next up, let's talk about another big band, big release from the 70s, that's Kiss. The glam rock, or just stadium rock band, whatever you want to call them. They released their debut album, also self-titled, in 1974. Unmistakable with the makeup. You all know them, you all love them or hate them. They're a Marmite band, but they are an important band. They inspired so many other artists to create, and they're still a classic in the genre, and this is one of the classics of the band. Strutter, Firehouse, Deuce, lots of good songs. Makeup is unmistakable. The theatrics is unmistakable. Probably inspired a lot of bands with the whole stage show, pyrotechnics, theatrics of everything they were doing on the stage. Probably inspired loads of bands. Probably inspired people like Iron Maiden. A lot of bands would have looked up to Kiss for that kind of stage show. And no one really did it better back then. But it wasn't my favourite. Again, like the Sabbath, it wasn't my favourite album by them. 1979's Dynasty is probably my favourite. I mean, I Was Made for Loving You, cheesy as fuck, but really enjoyable. That's catchy as hell. I like it. You know, what can I say? I like it. Dirty Living as well. Lots of good, cheesy rock anthems on Dynasty. So that happens to be my favourite from pre-1980 Kiss. Destroyer is another big release. When it starts off with Detroit Rock City, you know you're in for a good time. Shout It Out Loud and God of Thunder, some of the best songs on this album as well. So definitely give Destroyer a listen as well. Yeah, Kiss, one of the biggest acts from the 1970s. So let's move on to another band. 1974, 4 years after Black Sabbath's debut, Judas Priest came out with their debut, Rock and Rolla. Now this is a much more heavy metal band than Black Sabbath, in my opinion. The guitar, the solos, just the rhythms of everything, his vocals, it felt more metal. I would say that Judas Priest is probably the first proper metal band. Black Sabbath did pioneer it, and it is more doomier, more rockier, but the sound on Judas Priest is unmistakable. The sound on this album is unmistakable. It's metal. This is when metal is like tried and true. You cannot argue that this is not metal. This isn't rock. You could argue that the Black Sabbath albums were rock, psychedelic rock, but this definitely isn't. Absolutely not. This is when it gets a foothold into metal, and this album's fucking fantastic. But again, not my favourite. The second album, Sad Wings of Destiny. Now that is a fucking masterpiece. 1976, 6 years after Sabbath's debut, this album came out and changed the game. So many metal bands cite this as one of the inspirations for getting into metal itself. When it starts off with the 7-minute long monolithic song Victims of Change, you know you're in for a good ride. And then Ripper as well, fast as hell, furious, intense, all the things you want on a metal album. Dreamer Deceiver as well, Tyrant. There's too many good songs on Sad Wings of Destiny. Underrated as hell. This is an underrated album. Definitely, probably the album I'd say check out from 1970s. Sad Wings of Destiny. Easily one of my favourites, easily one of the best. If you haven't given it time, go give it some love. 1975, Rainbow released Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. I swear all the albums pre-1980 are all pretty much self-fucking titled. But it's another great release. Prog rock, prog metal. It's hard to know what this genre actually is on this one. But again, classic release, but not my favourite. My favourite is Rainbow's Rising. 1976, great year for metal, really. Now this has the legendary Ronnie James Dio on vocals, so you know the singing is going to be out of this goddamn world. And it is. When it starts off with Tarot Woman, again, you know you're in for something special. And this album delivers. It's one of the classics in heavy metal. That singing is just unmistakable. It's unmistakable. And these songs, the solos, the rhythms, the riffs, it has everything you need. Starstruck and Stargazer. Woo, these songs are amazing. Stargazer especially. One of the better songs from 1970s. Another album. Another classic album you need to have in your collection and you need to check out. Next in 1975, we're going a year prior. I'm kind of flip-flopping between years, but, you know, fuck it. It's a musical journey. It's fun. 1975, AC/DC, legendary rock band. You all know them. Released TNT. It's dynamite. Sorry for that. That's terrible. But the album's really fucking good. One of my favourite AC/DC albums. I mean, it has TNT on. That's literally the best AC/DC song. It's a long way from the top if you want to rock and roll. Another classic on this album, Livewire, High Voltage. This has more bang for your buck than a lot of AC/DC albums. And I think it's one of the best, and it's why I'm talking about it, because it is my favourite by them. It's one of my favourites by them. So, another big ass release from 1970s, and one you should 100% check out. Now we're getting into the heaviest band from the 1970s, the heaviest, the most edgy, kind of incorporate punk with metal, and you know what I'm talking about? Lemmy himself, the god, Motorhead, released their debut album 1977, and this changed the game. Before, metal was very theatrical, it was very subdued. Now it's fast and thrashy as fuck. And this is before thrash metal. Thrash metal did not exist. I think Motorhead kind of inspired thrash with all the fast tempos, those amazing vocals, fast tempo, how aggressive and heavy everything is. Motorhead and Judas Priest definitely fucking influenced heavy metal as we know it. My favourite was in the 1980 video, but this is still a landmark release and one that needs exploring, one that needs talking about, because it made metal heavy. Before this, metal was just metal. Now it's heavy metal. I think this is the album, this or Judas Priest was the album that changed it from metal to heavy metal. So it needs exploring, needs talking about. So that does it for this video. There is a lot I've missed off. Saxon's debut came out in '79, which is a fantastic release as well. And Rush's debut, 1974, fantastic prog rock band. So there's so many good albums pre-1980. Tell me in the comments below your favourites from the 1970s or even earlier. What do you think is the album that made heavy metal? Do you think it's Black Sabbath's debut? Do you think it's Judas Priest's debut? Or Motorhead's? Let me know in the comments below, and we'll see you again on another Quest for Metal.